Hi, Matt here from RetroOnly.com. Today we will be talking about whether Sega is owned by Disney. Before we get into that, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. There is a lot of controversy about who owns Sega. Some people say it is Sony, while other people say Nintendo. The most recent thing that people seem to think is that Sega was bought out by Disney, but is it true? Who really owns Sega? At this time, Sega is not owned by any of the previously mentioned companies. Sega is actually owned by Sega, and is still operating as its own individual entity. Sega Games Co., Ltd. is a Japanese video game developer, an arcade software and hardware game developer as well. The headquarters of Sega is in Tokyo, Japan, Irvine, California, and London, England. Sega has built two international branches called Sega of America and Sega Europe. But what if Disney had bought Sega? Throughout the years, people have suggested that Disney, Sony, Microsoft, and even Toshiba should buy Sega. Now, Sega is a third-party software developer company, and it certainly seems like they are releasing awful games, ignoring their great franchises, and have quite a limited production team. Once upon a time, Sega had some awesome games that totally rocked. But if Sega wants to come back and be on top again, it will be very hard because of the strong competition. Companies like Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo now own virtually all of the video game console sales in the world. These three giant companies basically own the entire video game market currently, and that is unlikely to change in the future. If Sega wants to come back and be a serious contender against Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, then Sega needs to make some major investments and restructuring of its business practices, networks, and probably the business model too. The only thing that could possibly make Sega competitive again is if a major company like Disney would purchase Sega and then make Sega the sole producer for all of Disney's characters and games. This would be similar to the way that Nintendo has carved out a niche for themselves. In 2019, Disney made $69.57 billion in revenue. With all that money, we know that Disney could invest in Sega if they really wanted to. If Disney did indeed buy Sega, then it would give Sega the opportunity to rejoin the market and have a big comeback. Although at this time, Disney has not commented on if they would purchase Sega in the future, in our opinion, it is much more likely that Disney would simply open their own gaming arm rather than purchasing Sega. But is Sega developing any Disney games? Sega developed many Disney video games that were released exclusively on their consoles throughout the 1990s. Sega's mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Dr. Evo Eggman Robotnik, the main antagonist of the Sonic the Hedgehog series, both made cameo appearances in Wreck-It Ralph in 2012 and its sequel in 2018. Prior to that, reruns of The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog were shown on Toon Disney from 1998 to 2002, and reruns of Sonic Underground aired on Disney XD in 2012. After Sonic Boom stopped airing on Cartoon Network and Boomerang, the series began airing on Disney Channel and later on Disney XD. Despite all that, at this time Sega is not currently developing any Disney games, but it is actually in the process of making the Sonic the Hedgehog movie series. So why did Sega shift to third-party software development? Sega shifted to third-party software development because Sega needed more money after they released the Dreamcast system. Sega launched the Dreamcast in 1998 in Japan, and the entire stock of 150,000 consoles sold out by the end of the day. After being released in Japan, the Sega Dreamcast was released in the USA and Europe. These releases produced millions of sales within a short time. But sadly, after a few years, the sales rate began decreasing quite quickly. The Dreamcast launch had been successful, but Sony still held over 60% of the game market in the US with the PlayStation. In 1999, Sony revealed their second generation PlayStation, and in the same year, Nintendo announced their next generation game console as well. And at the same time, Microsoft also began to develop its Xbox. With all these new game systems taking over the market, Sega took a big hit financially. In March of 2001, Sega posted a consolidated net loss of $417.5 million. In May 22nd of 2000, CSK chairman Isao Okawa replaced Irimajari as president of Sega. Okawa had long thought that Sega should abandon the console business. Others, including Sega's co-founder David Rawson, shared the same view. He had always felt it was a bit crazy for them to be limiting their potential to just Sega game systems. Stoller had suggested that Sega should have sold their company to Microsoft a long time ago. In a September 2000 meeting with Sega's Japanese executives and heads of its first-party game studios, Moore and Sega of America executive Charles Belfield recommended that Sega abandon its console business. And in response, all of the studio heads walked out. Sega announced an official company name change from Sega Enterprises to Sega Corporation, effective November 1st, 2000. Sega stated in a release that this was to display its commitment to its network entertainment business. On January 23, 2001, Japanese newspaper Nihon Kazi Shimbun reported that Sega would cease production of the Dreamcast and develop software for other platforms. After an initial denial, Sega of Japan released a press statement confirming that they were considering producing software for the PlayStation 2 and Game Boy Advance as part of their new management policy. Moving on, is Sonic the Hedgehog owned by Disney? Of course, the Japanese video game series and media franchise created by the Sega team is known as Sonic the Hedgehog. The series is actually owned by Sega and not by Disney. The franchise centers on Sonic, an anthropomorphic blue hedgehog who battles the evil Dr. Eggman, a mad scientist. The main Sonic the Hedgehog games were developed by Sega's team. Later, other games were developed by various studios, including spin-offs set in the racing, fighting, party, and sports genres. The franchise also incorporates printed media, animations, and a 2020 feature film. The first Sonic game, released in 1991 for the Sega Genesis, was developed after Sega requested a new mascot character to replace Alex Kidd. That way they could compete with Nintendo's mascot, Mario. Its success helped Sega become one of the leading video game companies during the 16-bit era of the early 1990s. Sega Technical Institute developed the next 3 Sonic games in addition to Sonic Spinball. After a break during the unsuccessful Saturn era, the first major 3D Sonic game, Sonic Adventure, was released in 1998 for the Dreamcast. But then Sega once again left the console market and shifted to only third-party development beginning in 2001. This allowed the Sonic series to continue on Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation systems. Sega History. Sega developed its first coin-operated game with Periscope in the late 1960s. In an effort to become a publicly traded company, Sega was sold to Gulf and Western Industries in 1961. In the 1980s, Sega started to develop game consoles. And from 1983 to 2001, they released a total of 5 different game consoles. Sega had a huge profit loss and got out of the console market soon after the release of their 5th console, the Dreamcast. Sega did develop many Disney video games that were released exclusively on their consoles throughout the 1990s. So this is probably why many people believe that they are owned by Disney, even though they are not. So what about Sony and Nintendo? In real life, these two companies are the main competitors of Sega. When Sega started to release game consoles, Nintendo was the first major competitor to battle Sega with their NES. And after only a few short years, Sony basically took over the entire game market in the United States with their PlayStation. Sega released a total of 5 different game consoles: the SG-1000, the Master System, the Genesis/Mega Drive, the Sega Saturn, and the Dreamcast. In 1999, the Sega Dreamcast was released, and it was exactly what the gaming community was looking for. Sales were through the roof, and it took over 31% of the gaming market in the United States. At that same time, Sony had 60% of the game market, with the release of their first ever PlayStation. Nintendo was also trying to make their mark and come out with the next big gaming system. Of course, all of this cut into the Dreamcast sales, and Sega eventually stopped making consoles entirely. So let's wrap it up. Here is the big question we all want to know the answer to. Is Disney going to buy Sega? Many people suggest that Disney, Sony, or Nintendo should buy Sega so that Sega can make a comeback with their new console, or so that these companies could take over the Sonic franchise. The likelihood of one of the major console makers buying Sega to make a console is pretty low, but they certainly could buy it to get access just to the Sonic franchise. Another possibility is that a company that currently isn't in the console business could buy Sega and revive that arm of the business. Disney or even Amazon would be a great possibility, but as of now, there hasn't been any inklings of a buyout happening anytime soon. This has been Matt from RetroOnly.com. Please be sure to like and subscribe to our channel.